Imagine stepping onto a red double-decker bus on a gray January morning in 1973. The windows are fogged with condensation, and as you climb the narrow stairs to the upper deck, you're met with something that would be utterly unthinkable today. A thick, choking haze of cigarette smoke hanging in the air like a permanent fog. The smell clings to your coat, your hair, your very skin. This wasn't considered unusual. This wasn't seen as dangerous. This was simply the way things were. The 1970s in Britain was a world of freedoms we've since decided were far too dangerous to keep. Today we're going to explore 12 everyday habits that were perfectly normal, perfectly legal, and perfectly accepted in 1970s Britain, but are now completely banned. Number 12. Smoking on public transport. Picture this. You've just finished your shift at the factory, or perhaps the office, and you're queuing at the bus stop on a drizzly Thursday evening. When the bus finally arrives, you climb aboard, pay your fare to the conductor, those delightful characters who'd walk up and down the aisles with their ticket machines, and you light up a cigarette, not in a designated area, not outside. Right there, in your seat. The upper decks of buses were particularly popular for smokers, and the air up there was thick enough to cut with a knife. Trains were no different. The smell of Embassy No. 1 and Players Navy Cut would mingle with the scent of British Rail tea and stale sandwiches. People would smoke through entire journeys from London to Manchester without a second thought. It wasn't just accepted, it was expected. If you were a non-smoker, well, that was your problem to manage, not theirs. Today, the very thought is extraordinary. Smoking has been banned on all public transport since the 1980s, and the idea of lighting up on a bus would see you ejected immediately, possibly arrested for public order offenses. We've come to understand what those passengers in the 1970s couldn't have fully grasped, that secondhand smoke in enclosed spaces was slowly poisoning everyone aboard. Number 11. Children traveling in cars without seat belts. There's a photograph I remember from my childhood, taken on a family trip to Margate in the summer of 1976, that scorching, unforgettable summer. In the back of our Ford Cortina, my sister and I are sprawled across the back seat, no belts, no restraints, just two children rolling about like loose parcels every time Dad took a corner. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't considered dangerous parenting. This was absolutely standard. In the 1970s, seatbelt laws were virtually non-existent. The front seatbelt law didn't come in until 1983, and rear seatbelts weren't mandatory until 1991. Before that, children would stand up between the front seats, lean out of windows, even lie across the parcel shelf under the back window on long journeys. I remember the sensation of being thrown forward when Dad braked suddenly, catching yourself on the back of the front seat and everyone just laughing it off. The car itself was your protection, we thought. Today, of course, this is not just banned, but virtually unthinkable. Every child must be in an appropriate car seat or booster seat until they're 12 years old or 135 centimeters tall. The fines are substantial, and quite rightly so. We've learned, through countless tragedies and decades of safety research, that an unrestrained child in a car is a child at terrible risk. What felt like freedom then was actually a form of daily Russian roulette. Number 10. Corporal punishment in schools. The sound is something I'll never forget. The sharp crack of the cane against the headmaster's desk meant to terrify you before it ever touched your hand. In the 1970s, if you misbehaved in school, if you talked back to a teacher, if you forgot your homework, if you were caught running in the corridor, you could expect the cane, the slipper, or the wooden ruler across your knuckles. This wasn't considered abuse. This was discipline. I remember standing outside Mr. Henderson's office, age 9, knowing what was coming, that particular cold dread in your stomach. The cane was usually across your palm, and you were expected to hold your hand out steady. If you pulled away, you got an extra stroke. The pain was sharp and immediate, but the humiliation was worse. You'd return to class with red throbbing hands, and everyone knew what had happened. Girls got it too, though sometimes the slipper across the backside instead. There was a perverse pride in not crying, in taking your punishment like you were told to be brave. Today, corporal punishment in state schools has been banned since 1986 and in all schools, including private ones, since 1998. The very idea of a teacher striking a child is grounds for immediate dismissal and potential criminal charges. We've recognized that hitting children doesn't teach them right from wrong. It teaches them that violence is an acceptable response to frustration. But in the 1970s, it was so normalized that parents would actually tell teachers, if he acts up, give him a good wallop. Number 9. Smoking in hospitals. This one seems almost surreal to contemplate now. Picture a hospital ward in 1974. A long room with iron-framed beds lined up in neat rows, each with its little bedside cabinet. And in those beds, patients recovering from surgery, dealing with respiratory illnesses, even lung disease, and they're smoking. Nurses would push around trolleys selling cigarettes and tobacco. Visitors would light up while sitting beside their sick relatives. Doctors would smoke in their offices between rounds. The waiting rooms in outpatient departments had ashtrays on every surface, and by the afternoon, you could barely see across the room for the haze. There was even smoking in maternity wards, mothers with newborns in their arms, lighting up to calm their nerves. No one saw the bitter irony. The very place meant to heal you was filled with toxic smoke. Cigarettes were sold in hospital shops alongside get-well-soon cards and flowers. I remember visiting my grandfather after his heart attack in 1977, and he was in a ward where at least half the men were smoking in their beds. The nurses didn't stop them. Why would they? They were probably on their way to the nurses' station for a cigarette themselves. Today, of course, all NHS hospitals have been completely smoke-free since 2006, with smoking banned even in the grounds of many hospitals. The contrast couldn't be starker. We've learned that hospitals must be sanctuaries of health, not venues for the very habits that make us ill. Number 8. Children buying cigarettes for their parents. Every corner shop in Britain in the 1970s had a child who'd come in regularly with a note from Mum or Dad. 20 embassy tipped, please, Mr. Patel. Mum says to put it on the account. And off you'd go with a packet of cigarettes clutched in your small hand, maybe stopping to buy yourself some penny sweets with the change. This was considered a perfectly reasonable errand for an 8-year-old. In fact, it was one of those little responsibilities that made you feel grown up. I remember being sent to buy cigarettes for my father from about age 7. The shopkeeper knew me, knew my family, and never questioned it. Sometimes, if I was buying them with cash rather than on account, I'd get to keep the 3-pence change to spend on blackjacks or fruit salads. There was no age restriction on purchasing cigarettes on behalf of an adult. The law assumed that if a child was buying them, it was for a parent, and that was fine. Some shops would even sell directly to children if they claimed they were, "For me, Dad." The trust was implicit, and the danger was never considered. Today, this is completely illegal. You must be 18 to buy tobacco products, and shopkeepers who sell to anyone underage face enormous fines and the loss of their license. We've recognized that making cigarettes easily accessible to children, even on behalf of adults, normalizes smoking and makes it more likely children will take it up themselves. Number 7. Lead paint in homes and schools. The walls of the 1970s British home had a secret poison. If you were a child in that decade, you almost certainly grew up surrounded by lead paint. It was everywhere. On windowsills, door frames, radiators, skirting boards, garden fences, children's furniture. Lead made paint more durable, helped it dry faster, and gave it that lovely, glossy finish that was so popular. No one thought twice about it. If paint was chipping off the nursery window frame, you might even see a young child picking at it, putting it in their mouth. Toddlers would teethe on window ledges covered in decades of lead-based paint. The playgrounds and schools were covered in it too, bright reds and blues and greens, all laced with lead. I remember the taste of paint chips, that slightly sweet metallic flavor. We didn't know. Our parents didn't know. Even when the dangers started to become clear, the change was slow. It wasn't until the late 1980s that lead paint was finally phased out entirely. Today, we understand that lead is a neurotoxin that affects children's developing brains, causing learning difficulties, behavioral problems, and even reduced IQ. The use of lead paint is now completely banned in the UK, and if you're renovating an older home, you must take extensive precautions to manage any lead paint safely. But for those of us who grew up in the 1970s, we were unwittingly exposed every single day. Number 6. Asbestos in public buildings. If you attended school in Britain in the 1970s, there's a very good chance you were sitting in a classroom insulated with asbestos. If you worked in an office, a factory, a hospital, or virtually any public building, you were surrounded by it. Asbestos was seen as a miracle material, fireproof, excellent insulation, durable, and cheap. It was in the ceiling tiles of nearly every school built in the 1960s and 1970s, in the pipe insulation, in the walls, even in some floor tiles. The fluffy white insulation around pipes looked almost like cotton wool. I remember in our school there were ceiling panels that would occasionally crack or crumble, and dust would drift down onto our desks. We'd brush it off our books and carry on with our lessons. No one wore protective equipment when working with asbestos. Builders and maintenance workers would cut through it, drill it, remove it, breathing in the fibers all day long. The lag on heating pipes would crumble in your hands and you'd think nothing of it. The danger was known in scientific circles, but it hadn't filtered through to public consciousness. Asbestos wasn't banned in Britain until 1999, shockingly late. Today, we know that those fibers, once breathed in, can cause terrible diseases decades later: asbestosis, mesothelioma, lung cancer. Any building containing asbestos must have it carefully managed or removed by licensed specialists wearing full protective gear. The material that was once in virtually every building in Britain is now treated like the deadly substance it always was. Number 5. Smoking on aeroplanes. Imagine settling into your seat on a British Airways flight from London to Edinburgh in 1975. You're in a window seat, looking forward to the in-flight service, that little meal on a tray, the complimentary drink. And all around you, people are lighting up. The section of the plane was divided into smoking and non-smoking, but it was all one cabin, one shared air system. The smoke drifted freely from one section to another, which rather defeated the purpose. Flight attendants, those glamorous figures in their smart uniforms, would walk down the aisles with trolleys offering duty-free cigarettes and cigars. They'd light passengers' cigarettes with elegant little lighters. There were ashtrays built into the armrests of every seat, little flip-up metal dishes. By the end of a long-haul flight, the air in the cabin would be thick and stale, your clothes reeking of smoke even if you hadn't lit up yourself. But this was normal. This was flying. If you objected to the smoke, you were the awkward one, the fussy one. I remember my mother developing a headache on every flight we took, and my father telling her to stop complaining. Today, smoking on aircraft has been banned on UK flights since the late 1990s, and the ashtrays have been removed from planes. It's actually a criminal offense now, with potential jail time for anyone who tries it. The very thought of someone lighting a cigarette mid-flight would cause immediate alarm and possibly an emergency landing. But in the 1970s, it was just part of the journey. Number 4. Lenient drink driving laws. Friday night at the Red Lion, your local pub, sometime around 1972. You've had a long week at work, and you're standing at the bar with your mates, enjoying a few pints of bitter. 4, maybe 5 pints over the course of the evening. Then you finish your drink, say your goodbyes, Walk out to the car park, get in your Ford Escort, and drive home. This wasn't considered criminal. This wasn't seen as dangerous. This was just what men did. The drink driving limit had only been introduced in 1967, set at 80 milligrams of alcohol per 100 milliliters of blood, where it remains today. But enforcement was minimal, and cultural attitudes were slow to change. The breathalyzer was still a relatively new invention, and police didn't have the resources, or, frankly, the inclination to stop every driver who'd had a drink. It was understood that a couple of pints was fine. The phrase, "one for the road," wasn't ironic. It was a genuine invitation to have a final drink before driving home. I remember my father driving us home from family gatherings after he'd had several whiskeys, and my mother would just tell him to be careful. The danger felt abstract, something that happened to other people, not to careful drivers like Dad. Today, of course, drink driving is taken far more seriously, with widespread police checks, severe penalties, and a complete shift in social attitudes. While the legal limit hasn't changed, the enforcement and social stigma around drink driving have transformed. It's no longer acceptable to drive after just a couple of pints. We've learned through tragic loss that even small amounts of alcohol impair judgment and reaction time. But in the 1970s, it was part of the fabric of social life. Number 3, smoking in cinemas. Saturday night at the Odeon in 1971, you're queuing up for tickets to see a new film, maybe Get Carter or A Clockwork Orange, something a bit edgy. You buy your ticket, perhaps some Kia Ora, and a packet of Butterkiss popcorn, and you make your way into the auditorium. The seats are plush red velvet, slightly threadbare, and there's that distinctive smell of old cigarette smoke embedded in the fabric. The lights dim, the Pearl and Dean advert plays with its distinctive jingle, and all around you, people light up. The beam from the projector cuts through a thick haze of smoke. By the end of a 2-hour film, the air in the cinema was thick enough to sting your eyes. The floors were sticky with spilled drinks and littered with cigarette ends, despite the ushers with their torches trying to maintain order. There were ashtrays on the backs of seats in some cinemas, little metal things you could flip down. If you weren't a smoker, you just had to endure it. The smell would cling to your clothes and hair for the rest of the evening, but this was part of going to the pictures. The experience of cinema in the 1970s was inseparable from the smoke and the smell. Today, smoking has been banned in all enclosed public spaces, including cinemas, since 2007. The idea of lighting up in a cinema would see you removed immediately. Modern cinema-goers would be horrified at the thought. We've come to expect clean air as a basic right, not a luxury. But for decades, if you wanted to see a film, you breathed in everyone else's smoke. Number 2, children working in factories and mills at young ages. The school-leaving age in 1970s, Britain was 15 until 1972, when it was raised to 16. But even before you officially left school, it was perfectly legal and utterly normal for children to work. Paper rounds started as young as 12 or 13, but those were the respectable jobs. Many working-class children, particularly in the North, would work in factories, textile mills, or shops after school and during holidays. I knew lads who worked in mills from age 14, doing proper shifts during school holidays. The work was hard, sometimes dangerous, and the hours were long. They'd operate machinery that today would require extensive safety training and age restrictions. There were lasses working in fish processing plants in Grimsby and Hull, boys working in steel foundries in Sheffield, children working in coal mines doing surface jobs. This wasn't seen as exploitation. It was seen as learning a trade, contributing to the family income, becoming responsible. Many families needed that extra income desperately. There was a pride in it, too. You were doing your bit. You were becoming an adult. The work was often poorly paid, and the conditions would horrify modern safety inspectors. But regulations were far looser, and the culture was one of getting on with it. Today, the laws around child labor are strict and comprehensive. Children under 13 cannot work at all. At 13 and 14, there are strict limits on hours, types of work, and conditions. The kind of factory and mill work that was common in the 1970s is now completely illegal for anyone under 16, and even then, there are extensive protections. We've recognized that childhood should be about education and development, not industrial labor. But for many children of the 1970s, work was simply part of growing up. Number 1, smacking other people's children. This one might surprise you, but in 1970s Britain, if you misbehaved in someone else's home or in the street or at a neighbor's house, it wasn't just your own parents who would discipline you. The whole community felt they had that right and responsibility. If Mrs. Thompson next door caught you climbing on her wall, she might give you a clip round the ear and send you home with a flea in your ear. If you were caught scrumping apples from someone's garden, the homeowner might grab you by the collar and give you a smack on the backside before marching you home to your parents. And your parents wouldn't complain. They'd likely give you another smacking for embarrassing them and for getting caught. This was called community discipline, and it was seen as a sign of a healthy, close-knit society where everyone looked after everyone else's children. Teachers could hit you, as we've discussed. So could your neighbors, family, friends, aunts, and uncles, even the local Bobby, if he caught you causing trouble. The phrase, "it takes a village to raise a child," was taken literally. There was an implicit understanding that adults had authority over all children, not just their own. I remember being told off and threatened with a smack by various adults throughout my childhood. The woman who ran the corner shop if she thought you were pinching sweets, the man at the allotments if you walked on his vegetables, even the bus conductor if you were mucking about. Today this is completely unacceptable and, depending on the severity, potentially criminal. Assault is assault, whether the victim is a child or an adult. If an adult struck someone else's child today, they could face charges, and the parents would likely call the police. We've recognized that physical punishment, especially from non-parents, is inappropriate and potentially harmful. But in the 1970s, it was seen as responsible community behavior. These weren't ancient habits from some distant, sepia-toned past. These were the everyday realities of life less than 50 years ago, in the lifetime of people who are still very much alive and working today. They weren't acts of cruelty or negligence, they were simply normal. The 1970s in Britain was a time when freedom often meant freedom from safety regulations, from health protections, from the kind of oversight we now take for granted. Looking back, it seems extraordinary that we survived at all. The air we breathed was poisoned with smoke and asbestos. The cars we traveled in were death traps. The schools were places where adults could strike children with impunity. And yet, at the time, none of this felt dangerous or wrong. It felt like life. What these 12 banned habits reveal is how dramatically our understanding of safety, health, and responsibility has shifted. We've learned that secondhand smoke kills, that lead damages developing brains, that children need protection, not physical punishment. We've recognized that freedom isn't just the absence of rules. It's the presence of protections that allow everyone, especially the most vulnerable, to thrive. Some will say we've become too cautious, too regulated, that we've lost something valuable in the process. And perhaps there's a sliver of truth in that. The 1970s had a certain freedom, a rough and tumble quality, a sense that children were tougher and adults were more self-reliant. But that freedom came at a terrible cost, one we counted in preventable diseases, in accidents, in lives cut short or diminished. The Britain of the 1970s is gone, and most of these changes are for the better. We live longer, healthier lives. Our children are safer. Our air is cleaner. But there's something else we've lost, something harder to quantify. Perhaps it's the sense of community discipline, the idea that neighbors looked out for one another's children. Perhaps it's a certain robustness, a willingness to take risks and live with discomfort. Or perhaps it's simply the innocence of not knowing the dangers that surrounded us, the bliss of ignorance before science and statistics revealed the truth. As I think back to those smoky buses, those unbuckled car journeys, those radiators covered in toxic paint, I feel a complicated mixture of nostalgia and relief. Nostalgia for the world I knew as a child, for the simplicity of not worrying about every potential harm, but relief that my own children and grandchildren are growing up in a world that, for all its flaws, takes their safety and well-being more seriously than we did. These banned habits are a reminder that progress, real progress, isn't always about new technologies or great discoveries. Sometimes it's about recognizing the harms we've been inflicting on ourselves and having the courage to stop. The 1970s was a different country, one where we did things differently. Not better, not worse necessarily, but different in ways that now seem almost unimaginable. And perhaps that's the greatest measure of how far we've come, that the everyday habits of 50 years ago now seem like relics from another world entirely.